There comes a moment when the quiet room you enter feels less like an escape and more like a confrontation. You begin realizing that what you long believed was an extraordinary capacity for love was, in truth, an unconscious arrangement to keep the peace at your own psychological expense. When a person possessing an acute emotional receptivity decides to withdraw from the social marketplace, it is rarely a sudden or dramatic event, but rather a slow, silent cooling of the blood. You notice it first in the minor interactions, such as a message left unanswered for hours, not out of malice, but because the psychic energy required to formulate a response has simply evaporated. You sit at a dinner table listening to a familiar acquaintance recount their grievances, and instead of the usual rush of sympathetic identification, you feel an immense, leaden weight. The words reach you, but they no longer penetrate the boundary of your awareness. And for the first time, you do not reach out to steady their shaking hand. This withdrawal is not an act of hostility, though those around you will almost certainly interpret it as such, but rather the psyche asserting its own survival against the exhausting demands of social performance. The highly sensitive individual often operates as an open vessel, absorbing the unacknowledged tensions, the silent resentments, and the unlived lives of the people in their immediate environment. To choose peace over people is to admit that you can no longer carry the contents of other people's unconscious minds without drowning in them yourself. This realization brings with it a peculiar and uncomfortable isolation that changes the very texture of your daily life. When you cease to offer yourself as an emotional sponge, you discover that much of what you considered friendship was actually a subtle form of exploitation based on your willingness to be a repository for their shadow material. Consider the friend who calls only when their life is in disarray, or the colleague who uses your quiet presence to validate their own inflated persona. The moment you become polite but cold, a subtle shift occurs in their tone, and the warmth they once showed you vanishes, replaced by a sharp, defensive edge. They may accuse you of being distant, arrogant, or unfeeling, because your sudden boundary exposes their deep entitlement to your attention. It is a profoundly unsettling experience to realize that people became attached not to who you actually are, but to the version of you they learned how to navigate and use for their own psychological comfort. By refusing to play the role of the universal container, you force them to confront the emptiness or the rage they had previously projected onto you. And few people forgive you for making them look at their own reflections. You are left standing in the quiet of your own room, watching the social fabric fray around you, wondering if your long-standing kindness was ever truly a virtue, or merely a highly developed mechanism of self-preservation. Beneath this surface layer of exhaustion lies a hidden psychological mechanism that is far more difficult to face, which is the secret vanity of the highly receptive person. We must ask why you allowed your boundaries to remain so porous for so long, and the answer often reveals a subtle, unconscious demand for control disguised as moral superiority. To be the one who feels everything, the one who understands without being told, the one who heals the room by merely existing in it, provides the ego with an immense, unacknowledged inflation. You may have secretly believed that you were uniquely equipped to carry the suffering of others, a belief that fed a quiet pride and allowed you to avoid looking at your own internal disorder. This is the phenomenon of a house with one forbidden room, an inner architecture where you keep all your own unexpressed rage, your envy, and your deep hunger for recognition locked away, while you busy yourself tending to the gardens of everyone else. Your sensitivity became a persona, a highly effective mask of absolute selflessness that allowed you to feel necessary while remaining completely hidden. When you choose peace over people, you are not simply walking away from difficult personalities. You are walking away from the specific form of identity that required their brokenness to justify your existence. It is the collapse of a long-standing psychological contract, and the silence that follows is terrifying because it forces you to inhabit the very room you have spent a lifetime avoiding. The withdrawal of psychic energy from the collective environment always causes the projected world to lose its color, revealing the stark machinery of human nature that operates beneath social conventions. You begin to notice the unspoken power exchanges that govern everyday conversations, where a compliment is often a demand for reassurance, and a criticism is merely an attempt to transfer a sense of inferiority. I have often observed that when a highly sensitive person stops participating in these unconscious negotiations, they become a source of intense anxiety to the group. Without your compliance, the hidden resentments within a family system or a professional circle have nowhere to go, and they begin to accumulate like gas in an enclosed space. A simple disagreement over a trivial matter, such as who will host a holiday gathering or how a project should be managed, suddenly takes on the weight of an existential crisis because you are no longer willing to smooth over the rough edges with your own comfort. Your silence becomes a mirror that reflects the group's collective shadow, and because they cannot face the darkness within themselves, they must blame the mirror for creating it. The peace you have chosen is not a gentle, pastoral quietude, but the cold, objective stillness of an observer who has stepped outside the theater and can now see the ropes, the pulleys, and the desperate expressions of the actors on the stage. This colder perspective inevitably dismantles the long-cherished illusion that your absolute receptivity was a form of pure, unblemished empathy. When you look back at the interactions that left you most exhausted, you perceive that your willingness to absorb another person's emotional force was often a form of cowardice, a refusal to endure the friction of a necessary conflict. You allowed others to dominate the psychological space because you feared the raw, chaotic energy of their anger, choosing instead to swallow their tension and transform it into your own physical fatigue or private resentment. The collapse of this illusion is painful because it strips away the moral performance of the helper, leaving you to confront the reality that your porous boundaries were maintained by a deep, unconscious fear of being disliked or rejected. You see that by constantly anticipating the needs of others and adjusting your internal temperature to match theirs, you were engaging in a sophisticated strategy of manipulation designed to buy safety in a world you felt unequipped to face. The house with one forbidden room can no longer remain locked, for the walls themselves begin to sweat with the moisture of your own denied instincts, your own frustration, and your own unlived life. The peace you are moving toward demands that you stop pretending to be a saint, so that you may finally begin the far more difficult task of becoming a complete human being. The psyche now exerts a relentless pressure toward a state of being where you must learn to bear the weight of your own consciousness without seeking validation from the collective. This individuation pressure manifests as a profound intolerance for anything superficial, turning an ordinary social gathering into an ordeal where the polite chatter feels like a betrayal of your deeper nature. An awkward silence in a casual conversation, which you once would have rushed to fill with an eager compliment or an entertaining story, is now left to sit heavily in the air, because you no longer feel responsible for the comfort of the room. This shift is not a matter of choice, but an evolutionary necessity of the mind, which realizes that it has run out of the psychic energy required to maintain the fiction of your old persona. You find yourself retreating into a solitude that feels less like a luxury and more like a psychological laboratory, where the external noises are turned down so that the internal voices can finally be heard. In this stillness, the emotional states you experience are no longer the borrowed suffering of your friends or family, but the genuine, raw material of your own unconscious depths, demanding to be recognized and integrated. The burden of seeing too much is that you can no longer return to the comfortable blindness of the crowd, and you must accept that the price of your inner clarity is a permanent distance from the shared illusions of the social world. This withdrawal of emotional access changes your relationship to time itself, creating a slow, deliberate rhythm that feels entirely foreign to the frantic pace of the environment around you. A message left unanswered ceases to be a source of guilt and becomes a simple statement of your current capacity, a refusal to allow the demands of the outer world to dictate the state of your inner reality. You begin to understand that human beings adapt to access, and that as long as you made yourself universally available, you were ensuring that your own psychological reserves would remain permanently depleted. By stepping back, you force a redistribution of the emotional weight in your relationships, an act that inevitably causes some connections to wither and die, while others are forced to discover a rare, uncomfortable maturity. The realization that unfolds is not a triumphant victory over toxic influences, nor is it a comforting arrival at a state of healing, but a sober, ongoing negotiation with the limits of your own nature. You stand at the threshold of this new way of being, fully aware that the peace you have chosen is a lonely asset, one that requires you to defend the boundaries of your solitude against the constant, creeping demands of a world that prefers you compliant rather than whole.